Have you ever stopped to think that everything you know about the Vikings might be a beautifully told lie? The Vikings series transported us to a world of bloody rituals, shield walls, and the meteoric rise of Ragnar Lothbrok. But the truth hidden beneath the bearskins is far more controversial and counterintuitive than you might imagine. What if I told you that the series' greatest hero may never have existed as a single man? Or that the most feared warriors in history were, in fact, the vainest and most hygienic men in medieval Europe? In this epic journey, we'll dissect every detail of the production that conquered the world, separating documented historical fact from pure medieval gossip transformed into entertainment. The reward for those who stay until the end is clear. You'll never watch an episode the same way again. You'll discover how a people of farmers changed the world's DNA and why the series needed to lie to tell us the greatest truth of all. But before we hoist the sails, if you're fascinated by historical mysteries and want to help spread real knowledge around the world, subscribe to the channel and leave your like now. That's what keeps our fleet sailing. And since we're talking about travel, comment below where you're watching this video from. We want to know how far the cry of Skull is echoing today. If you have any other series or historical period that raises questions for you, leave your suggestion for our next itinerary. Before the first cracked-hulled ship touched the sands of Lindisfarne, and long before Ragnar Lothbrok became a name whispered with dread in European courts, Scandinavia was a mosaic of silence, ice, and an extremely sophisticated, albeit brutal, social organization. In the Viking series, we are introduced to a people who seem to live in an almost mystical isolation, where the idea of lands to the west is treated as heresy or the fantasy of a visionary farmer. However, historical truth paints a much more interconnected picture. Historically, the Norse peoples of the 8th century were no strangers to the outside world. The trade in furs, amber, and slaves already flowed through routes connecting the fjords of Norway to the markets of the Baltic and even the borders of the Frankish Empire. The tension that the Viking series establishes between Ragnar and Earl Haraldsson over the existence of England is a brilliant dramatic device to elevate the protagonist to the status of discoverer. But in reality, the Vikings already possessed sailors' accounts and commercial evidence that the British Isles were there. What changed was not the discovery, but the intention, the transition from seasonal traders to organized predators. The socio-economic conditions that paved this path were urgent. Scandinavia suffered from a scarcity of arable land and an inheritance system that left younger sons with nothing but their courage and steel. The sea is not a barrier. It is a road that our gods paved with salt, an anonymous skald is said to have remarked. While in the Vikings series we see a static and isolated Kattegat, real Scandinavia teemed with local chieftains vying for prestige. Prestige in Norse culture came not only from land ownership, but also from the ability to distribute silver and gifts. This political need for quick wealth was the fuel that transformed farmers into raiders. Therefore, the period before the series is marked by unsustainable internal pressure. The naval technology, which we will explore later, was already mature. What was lacking was the catalyst, a figure or group bold enough to test the defenses of Christendom. The Viking series embodies this catalyst in Ragnar. But history shows us that the movement was a collective response from a people who simply overcame the limits of their own geography. And if this story of expansion and ancestral secrets has already captivated you, leave a like so that the algorithm delivers this knowledge to more explorers like you. In the Viking series, Ragnar Lothbrok is the central figure, the multifaceted hero who embodies the intellectual curiosity and brute strength of his people. He is portrayed as the first to sail west, the first to besiege Paris, and the father of a line of kings. However, when we delve into the annals of history, Ragnar's figure becomes hazy, shrouded in the mists of the Norse sagas, like the Ragnar's saga fur coat. For fans of the series, it may be shocking to discover that for most modern historians, Ragnar Lothbrok likely never existed as a single individual, but rather as an amalgam. The Viking series uses poetic license to attribute to a single man feats that occurred over decades and were accomplished by different leaders. There was a Viking chieftain named Ragnar who besieged Paris in 845, and there was a Danish king named Horik, who also appears in the series. But the merging of these elements into Ragnar is a later literary construct. The Ragnar of the series is an archetypal representation of the Viking spirit. The thirst for knowledge represented by his obsession with Athelstan, and the thirst for glory that leads him to the snake pit. In the sagas, Ragnar is almost a demigod, the son of kings who slays dragons and conquers kingdoms with witty pronouncements. The series humanizes this myth, turning him into a farmer who defies the system. However, the truth behind the myth is that the name Lothbrok, meaning hairy breeches due to a legendary garment worn to fight a serpent, served as a powerful symbol of unification for later Vikings. By claiming descent from Ragnar, royal leaders like Ivar and Bjorn gained a divine legitimacy that no army could buy. "My sons will be more famous than I," declares Travis Fimmel's Ragnar, in a moment of epic introspection. This phrase resonates with the historical reality of the sagas. Ragnar's fame was built to justify the power of his sons. While the Viking series makes us love the man, history invites us to understand the myth as a political and poetic tool. He is the personification of the Nordic Golden Age, a mirror where the Vikings projected their greatest ideals of rebellion and conquest. Separating the man from the legend is impossible, and perhaps that is precisely what makes the series' narrative so fascinating for fans seeking to understand the Viking soul. One of the biggest points of confusion for fans of the Viking series is searching for Kattegat on Google Maps. In the show, Kattegat is presented as a stunning coastal village, nestled among majestic fjords that grows into a commercial metropolis and the capital of an empire. However, the first major geographical lie in the series is that Kattegat is not, and never was, a city. In reality, Kattegat is the name of a maritime area, a strait located between Jutland, Denmark, and the west coast of Sweden. The choice in the Viking series to transform a sea into a city is a narrative maneuver to create a safe haven and a sense of home for the characters. Historically, shopping malls like Hedeby in Denmark or Birka in Sweden would have been the real locations where the plot would unfold. These locations were vibrant, but they didn't possess the dramatic 600-meter-high fjords we see in the series, which, incidentally, was filmed in Ireland. The geography of real Scandinavia, especially Denmark, is predominantly flat, which facilitated agriculture but didn't offer the visual and defensive protection of the Norwegian fjords shown on screen. Furthermore, the Kattegat depicted in the Viking series evolves rapidly, showcasing a defensive architecture that often blends styles from different centuries. In real life, a Viking capital would have been a cluster of long wooden and turf houses, surrounded by a simple palisade. The importance of Kattegat in the series as the center of the Viking world ignores the fact that Norse power was decentralized and itinerant. Kings and chieftains traveled between their territories to administer justice and collect taxes. Nevertheless, the fictional Kattegat fulfills an essential symbolic role. It represents the transition of the Norse people. From an agricultural village at the beginning of the series to a center of global trade in the final seasons, it mirrors the Vikings' own trajectory throughout history. "This place is our heart," Lagertha would say during a moment of defending the city. Historically, the heart was the sea, the true Kattegat, which served as a road for expansion. By transforming the sea into dry land, the series gave fans an emotional point of reference, even if it sacrificed cartographic accuracy in the process. The first season of the Viking series, the central conflict between Ragnar Lothbrok and Earl Haraldsson, is presented as a classic struggle between the young visionary and the old tyrant. Haraldsson represents the fear of the unknown and absolute control, while Ragnar symbolizes progress. However, for the viewer seeking historical truth, this duel reveals much about the actual laws of succession and clan leadership, although the series takes significant dramatic liberties regarding the autocratic power of an earl. In historical reality, an earl or earl the Jarl was not an absolute king with uncontested power of life and death, as the Vikings series sometimes suggests. Norse society was governed by the Thing, an assembly of free men where laws were recited and disputes resolved. If a Jarl acted unjustly or selfishly, he could be deposed or even legally killed by his peers. Ragnar's challenge to Haraldsson in the series, culminating in a life-or-death duel, is an example of this. Holmgang, an institutionalized form of dueling to resolve disputes of honor or property. Historically, the tensions shown in the Vikings series regarding westward expansion would have a much more pragmatic than personal basis. Viking leadership depended on the distribution of wealth. If a jarl prevented his warriors from seeking gold and land, he would quickly lose his authority. Haraldsson, by forbidding Ragnar from sailing west, would be committing political suicide in real life. "I do not seek your place, I seek the horizon," says the fictional Ragnar. But in history, the horizon was what guaranteed any leader's position. The conflict between them, therefore, serves in the series to illustrate the transition from tribal leadership to leadership based on conquests and personal charisma, something that indeed marked the transition from the early Viking Age to the Golden Age. The Vikings series captivates audiences with the eccentric skills of Floki, the shipbuilder who seems to have a mystical connection to wood and the sea. One of the central points of the nautical plot is the use of the sunstone to find the position of the sun on cloudy days. For fans, this seems like a magical plot device, but this is one of the moments where the series touches on a fascinating and highly probable archaeological truth. The sunstone mentioned in the Vikings series is identified by modern scientists as the fluoride spathodir, Icelandic calcite. This mineral possesses polarizing properties that allow it to detect the sun even under dense layers of clouds or after sunset. Although no longship has been found with an intact sunstone, references in medieval texts and recent scientific tests confirm that such a technique was possible and extremely accurate. Unlike the series, where navigation seems like an almost secret of Ragnar and Floki, in real history, these techniques were the pinnacle of nautical engineering of the time, passed down from generation to generation. Beyond the stone, the Vikings series simplifies navigation by showing boats crossing the open sea in a straight line with ease. In reality, the Vikings used a combination of observing migratory birds, watercolor, whale behavior, and the solar quadrant to determine latitude. Floki embodies the artisan genius that allowed the Norsemen to dominate the North Atlantic. While the fiction focuses on the ritualistic and mystical aspect of Floki, history celebrates practical ingenuity. Without these real advancements, the invasions shown on screen would never have been more than fishermen's tales. The attack on the Lindisfarne monastery, depicted at the beginning of the Vikings series, is perhaps the most chronologically accurate historical event in the production. It occurred on June 8, 793 AD, and, just as on screen, was a seismic shock that echoed throughout Europe. For the monks, the sea brought demons. For Ragnar's Vikings in the series, it brought easy treasures guarded by men who do not fight. The Viking series perfectly captures the initial culture clash. The Norsemen did not understand the religious value of gold and Christian relics, seeing them only as precious metal. Historically, Alcuin of York's account of the event describes the Church of St. Cuthbert stained with the blood of God's priests. However, a crucial difference between fiction and history is that, while the series portrays Ragnar and his crew as the sole attackers, records suggest that the Viking fleet already operated with an organization involving more than one ship in exploratory raids. This event in the Viking series serves as the point of no return. It establishes the reputation for brutality of the Norsemen, which, while real, was often exaggerated by the Christian chroniclers of the time, the only ones who knew how to write. The series humanizes the attack by focusing on Ragnar's curiosity about the Christian faith and the capture of Athelstan. But historically, Lindisfarne was the sign that England's isolation had ended. From that moment on, the series' narrative and real history converge on one point: the world would never be the same again. If this historical reconstruction is opening your eyes to the secrets behind the scenes, leave a like and tell us, would you root for the Vikings or the monks in this confrontation? In the Viking series, Athelstan is much more than a slave. He is Ragnar Lothbrok's moral and intellectual compass. His journey, from Christian terror in Lindisfarne to the acceptance of Norse traditions, is one of the most beloved arcs among fans. However, when we look for the historical Athelstan in the chronicles of the Viking Age, we find a different reality. The character in the series is in fact a brilliant fictional construct used to represent the encounter and the conflict between two irreconcilable worldviews, Christian monotheism and pagan polytheism. Historically, there are no records of a monk named Athelstan becoming the close advisor of a Viking king like Ragnar. There was, however, a King Athelstan of England decades later, but the character in the series serves a greater narrative purpose. The Viking series uses him to show that the Norsemen were not just bloodthirsty barbarians, but men curious about the divine. In reality, Vikings frequently captured clergymen for ransom, as they were the only literate people and were worth a great deal of gold. Athelstan's internal conflict in the Viking series, torn between Christ and Odin, reflects a subtle historical truth: gradual cultural assimilation. Many Vikings who settled in England ended up adopting Christianity, not through a spiritual epiphany, but for political and commercial convenience. The friendship between him and Ragnar in the fiction symbolizes what history calls syncretism, where elements from both sides began to mix, forever changing the face of Europe. In my world, I am a believer. In yours, I am a sinner, Athelstan would say, summarizing the tension that the series masterfully explores. Lagertha is undoubtedly the face of female power in the Viking series. She is not only the wife of a hero, but a queen and fierce warrior who leads armies of shield maidens. For fans, Lagertha represents the freedom and strength of Norse women. However, the question that echoes among historians is, how far did Viking women actually go to war? The Viking series bases Lagertha on the accounts of Saxo Grammaticus, a 12th century chronicler who described a woman fighting alongside Ragnar with the courage of a man. However, many historians treat Saxo's writings with caution, suggesting that he may have mixed reality with myths of Valkyries. On the other hand, modern archaeology has given new life to the series' fiction. In 2017, DNA tests on the famous Berserker tomb in Sweden proved that one of the skeletons found with a complete panoply of war, swords, shields, and horses, belonged to a woman of high military status. Historical truth lies in the middle ground. While the Viking series may exaggerate the number of women on the battlefield for epic effect, it is correct in showing that Norse women had far more rights than their European contemporaries. They could divorce, inherit property, and manage farms while their husbands traveled. Lagertha in the series embodies this spirit of independence. Even if not all women were warriors, the political power that Lagertha wields in Kattegat resonates with the reality of powerful figures like Queen Åsa of Norway. In the drama of the Viking series, the rivalry between brothers Ragnar and Rollo is the driving force behind epic betrayals. Rollo, the warrior who lives in the shadow of his brother's genius, ends up betraying his people to become the first Duke of Normandy. If you're a fan who believes in this family tree, prepare for a centuries-old historical correction. Ragnar Lothbrok and Rollo were never brothers, and it's highly unlikely they ever met. In historical reality, the man who inspired the character Rollo was Hrolfr, a Viking leader who lived decades after the period attributed to the legendary Ragnar. The Viking series compresses the timeline to bring these two giants together on screen. The real Rollo was the leader who, after exhaustive raids in France, signed the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 AD with the French king Charles the Simple. In exchange for land, which would become Normandy, Rollo promised to protect Paris against other Vikings and to convert to Christianity. This lie in the Viking series is forgivable, given the dramatic weight it carries, but it erases the fact that Rollo was a conqueror in his own right, not motivated by a family feud. While the series shows Rollo fighting Ragnar in Paris, real history portrays him as a political strategist who founded a lineage that would lead directly to William the Conqueror. The series chose blood conflict. History chose the birth of a new European nobility. We've reached a visual breaking point: the costumes. In the Viking series, the characters sport dark leather clothing, modern haircuts with shaved sides, and intense face paint that makes them look like warriors from a post-apocalyptic film. It's an iconic look, but almost entirely fictional. If you could travel back in time and meet a real Viking, he would look much more colorful and much less metal-clad. The historical Vikings were masters of weaving. They wore wool and linen tunics in vibrant colors like blue, red, and yellow, obtained through expensive vegetable dyes. The excessive use of black leather and metal studs, so common in the Vikings series, is a modern aesthetic choice to convey an air of danger and rebellion. In reality, a wealthy Viking would flaunt silks imported from the East and fine furs as a sign of status, something the series rarely shows. Connection moment. If this journey behind the scenes of history is changing the way you see Kattegat, how about subscribing to the channel now? By doing so, you help spread real historical knowledge and ensure that more mysteries like this one are revealed. Also, leave a comment. Which city are you watching this video from? We want to know how far our ships are going, and if there's a story or period you've always wanted to see in an epic itinerary, suggest it below. Regarding makeup, the Viking series uses kohl excessively. Accounts from the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan mention that Vikings used eye paint, but for the Norse, appearance was a matter of cleanliness. They were known for combing their hair daily and changing clothes frequently, something that the dirty and grimy look in some episodes contradicts. The series chose the style. Real history preferred practical elegance. One of the wisest decisions made by the production of the Viking series was the absolute refusal to put horns on the warriors' helmets. For the average viewer, the image of the Viking has always been linked to these accessories, but this is a 19th century invention popularized by Wagner's operas. The series is right to show that, on the battlefield, practicality was the golden rule. A helmet with horns would be an easy target for an axe blow, serving only to dislocate the wearer's own neck. Historically, helmets were rare and expensive. Most of the real warriors who inspired the Viking series fought only with leather hats or bareheaded heads. The few who had iron protection wore the so-called Geirmundbu helmet, which had a kind of mask to protect the eyes and nose, giving it the appearance of goggles. The series, although it uses some stylized leather models for cost and aesthetic purposes, maintains the necessary sobriety. Iron protects life. Horn is only for drinking, a pragmatic warrior would say. By removing this cliché, the series helped educate a new generation of fans about the true face of Norse warfare. The episode in which Ragnar executes Jarl Borg using the blood eagle is undoubtedly one of the most disturbing and visually impactful moments in the entire Viking series. The scene depicts a ritual where the victim's ribs are cut from the spine and spread open like wings, while the lungs are pulled out. For fans, this solidified Ragnar's image as a ruthless leader. But what does history say about this brutal practice? The truth is that the blood eagle is one of the most debated topics among historians. It appears in several sagas, such as that of To Orkney, however. Many experts believe it was simply a translation error or a poetic exaggeration by the Norse skalds. In Latin and Old Norse, the descriptions are so complex that they could simply mean carving the image of an eagle into the back with a knife. Biologically, it is almost impossible to perform the procedure shown in the Viking series without the victim dying within seconds, defeating the purpose of the live sacrifice. The series chose the most literal and bloody interpretation to emphasize the foreign and terrifying aspect of pagan culture, transforming a literary metaphor into a visual nightmare. The domestic drama in the Viking series between Lagertha and Aslaug captured the hearts of audiences. In the fiction, Ragnar abandons his life with the shield maiden Lagertha because of a prophecy and the mystical beauty of Aslaug. Historically, however, the love life of the legendary Ragnar was even more complicated. According to the Norse sagas and the deeds of the Danes, Ragnar had not just two companions but three, and the circumstances were far less melodramatic and far more epic. The first wife mentioned in the story is Lagertha, followed by a woman named Thora Townheart, whom the series omitted completely, and finally, Aslaug. In the Viking series, the tension is focused on jealousy and destiny, but in the sagas, the marriage to Aslaug was a union of powerful lineages, as she was the daughter of the legendary dragon slayer Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. The series humanized Ragnar by showing him torn between the love of the past and the duty of the future. But the real story, or at least the version in the sagas, shows a man who collected alliances and descendants to ensure his name would never be forgotten, regardless of the feelings of the women involved. Many films, and even the Vikings series in its early episodes, tend to portray the Norse as grimy figures, covered in mud and dried blood. However, if you were in 9th century England, the Viking would be the best-smelling person in the village. Archaeologists have found more combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, and razors in Viking graves than any other hygiene item in contemporary cultures. History records that the Vikings bathed every Saturday. In Old Norse, Saturday is Saturday or bathing day, and frequently changed their tunics to display their wealth. In fact, English chronicles of the time complained that the Vikings were too seductive because they combed their hair, bathed, and changed clothes, which deceived Christian women into preferring them over less hygienic local husbands. The Vikings series eventually embraces this as the characters become wealthier, but the historical truth is that vanity was a central part of Nordic masculinity. They weren't just warriors, they were peacocks of iron and wool. The Siege of Paris in the 3rd season of the Vikings series is a cinematic triumph. We see Ragnar using floating siege towers and brilliant strategies to penetrate the fortified city. Historically, attacks on Paris were recurring and massive events. The Siege of 845 AD, led by a chieftain named Ragnar, whom many associate with Ragnar, involved 120 ships and thousands of men sailing up the Seine River. The Viking series portrays the city as an almost impregnable fortress, but in reality, Paris at the time was concentrated in Ile de la Cité. What the series gets absolutely right is the desperation of the Franks. Unable to repel the Vikings militarily, King Charles the Bald paid the first of many Danegelds, an impressive sum of $7,000 in silver and gold to get the Norsemen to leave. In the fiction, Ragnar fakes his own death to enter the city, a stratagem that the sagas attribute to his son Bjorn, or to the leader Halfdan in other cities. The real story of Paris was less about a fake coffin and more about a blank check that proved to the Vikings that blackmail was as lucrative as battle. In the Vikings series, Rollo's betrayal in Paris is portrayed as the final act of a resentful brother seeking his own glory. By accepting the title of Duke and marrying Princess Gisla, the fictional Rollo breaks all ties with his pagan past. However, if we look at French records, the trajectory of the historical Rollo, or Hrolfganger, is much more that of a pragmatic statesman than a family traitor. Historically, Rollo did not betray Ragnar, as they were never brothers. He was an independent leader who realized that the era of raiding was giving way to the era of colonization. The Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte in 911 AD was not a surrender, but an epic real estate deal. King Charles the Simple ceded the region we now call Normandy, land of the Northmen, on one condition: Rollo would act as a shield against other Vikings who came up the Seine. The Viking series is accurate in showing his conversion to Christianity, but history reveals that Rollo was such an efficient ruler that his lineage gave rise to William the Conqueror, who would change England forever in 1066. The betrayal in the series is drama. In history, it was the birth of a new European nobility. The moment when Ragnar Lothbrok is thrown into a pit full of venomous snakes by King Ella is perhaps the most iconic scene in the Viking series. With his gaze fixed on the sky, he prophesies that the little pigs will grunt when they learn how the old boar suffered. For fans, this is the ultimate sacrifice that unites his sons. But did this death actually happen? The truth is that Ragnar's death is the point where history and legend most intertwine. There are no contemporary English records that mention a Viking leader named Ragnar being executed in this way. King Ali of Northumbria was a real person, but the story of the snake pit only appears in the Norse sagas, written centuries later. Many historians suggest that, if Ragnar existed, he may have died in a shipwreck or from a common illness after the Siege of Paris. The Vikings series chose the saga's version because it provides the perfect casus belli, cause for war, for the invasion that would follow. The snake pit may be a poetic invention, but the emotional impact it had on the Norse, and on the series audience, was absolutely real. While Ragnar's death is shrouded in mystery, the answer to it is one of the best documented facts in medieval history. In the Vikings series, we see Ragnar's sons gathering a massive army to avenge their father. In historical reality, the Great Heathen Army. Misel here, they landed in East Anglia in 865 AD. and were not just a band of raiders, but a coordinated invasion force of thousands of warriors. Unlike the Viking series, which focuses on the emotional aspect of family revenge, the Great Army had clear political and territorial objectives. They didn't just want to kill King Alle, they wanted to conquer and colonize. For almost 14 years, this army devastated the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. The series gets the scale of the conflict and the brutality of Alle's defeat right, but history shows that this invasion was what forced England to begin uniting as a nation under a single crown in order to survive. "We did not come for silver, we came for land," would be the historical motto of this force that changed the English language and genetics forever. Ivar the Boneless is portrayed in the Viking series as a sadistic military genius who suffers from osteogenesis imperfecta, glass bones, being carried on a shield or wearing iron leg braces. This choice by the series is one of the most creative interpretations of an ambiguous historical nickname. But was the real Ivar truly disabled? The nickname Boneless, Ivar the Boneless, Ivar the Great Heathen appears in the sagas, and there are three main theories. The first from the series is that he was a debilitating physical condition. The second suggests it was a metaphor for sexual impotence. The third, and most accepted by military historians, is that Ivar was so agile and flexible in combat that he seemed to have no bones, a master of dodging and strategy. Regardless of his physical condition, the Viking series is faithful in portraying Ivar as the mastermind behind the Great Heathen army. Historical records describe him as the most ruthless of all, and a brilliant strategist who captured York and defeated Saxon kings with psychological tactics. The series transformed a disability into a source of hatred and power, creating one of television's most complex antagonists. In the Viking series, Bjorn Ironside fulfills his father's dream of exploring the Mediterranean, reaching the coasts of Africa and Italy. In a tense moment in the fiction, he believes he has arrived in Rome, only to discover he is in a smaller town called Luni. Surprisingly, this geographical error and the expedition itself are based on real historical accounts. Around 859 AD, the royal Bjorn and his mentor Hastein led a fleet of 62 ships through the Strait of Gibraltar. They plundered North Africa and southern France, eventually reaching Italy. The story of the false Rome is a favorite among historians. The Vikings, impressed by the Luni marble, thought it was the eternal city. To enter the city, they used the same trick of the false coffin that the series attributed to Ragnar in Paris. The Viking series does an excellent job of expanding the viewer's horizons, showing that the Norsemen were not just men of the ice, but global explorers who saw the desert sun and the ruins of the ancient Roman Empire. The episode from the first season of the Viking series that shows the pilgrimage to the Temple of Uppsala is one of the most impactful for the audience. In it, we see human and animal sacrifices hanging from trees, a 9-day festival that mixes religious ecstasy and bloodshed. For fans, this scene defines the strangeness of pagan culture. But how real was this barbarity? Historically, the Temple of Uppsala existed and was the spiritual center of the Swedes. The Viking series depiction is heavily based on the accounts of Adam of Bremen, an 11th century Christian chronicler. He wrote that every 9 years a festival took place where 9 males of every living species, including humans, were sacrificed and hung in the sacred grove. However, there is debate. Adam never went there. He wrote based on second-hand hearsay, possibly to portray pagans as monsters who needed to be converted. Archaeology has found human bones in pits in Sweden, suggesting that sacrifices did occur, but perhaps not on the industrial and theatrical scale shown in the series. Michael Hirst's work is correct in showing that, for the Vikings, sacrifice was not cruelty, but a necessary bargaining chip with the gods to ensure victory. In the Vikings series, Floki, disillusioned with the corruption of Kattegat, sets off alone and ends up discovering a land of the gods, which we now know as Iceland. His idealistic colony ends in tragedy and revenge. In historical reality, the discovery of Iceland was a gradual process of sailors diverted by storms, but there was indeed a real Floki. Hrafna Floki Vilgerdarson, Floki dos Corvos, was, according to the settlement book, Book of Settlements, the first Norseman to deliberately sail to Iceland in the 9th century. Unlike the Vikings series, where he seeks a spiritual paradise, the real Floki was a practical explorer who used ravens to locate land. He didn't find the island a paradise. In fact, he named it Iceland, land of ice, after a harsh winter killed his livestock, and returned to Norway speaking ill of the place. The series uses the figure of Floki to explore the spiritual side and mental isolation of a devotee of Odin, while history shows that the colonization of Iceland was motivated by people fleeing the tyranny of King Harald Finehair. In the Viking series, Alfred is portrayed from childhood as a frail yet brilliant young man, the illegitimate son of Judith and Athelstan. In adulthood, he becomes the king who studies his enemies in order to defeat them. Historically, Alfred the Great is the only English monarch to receive the title of the Great, and his portrayal in the series is surprisingly faithful to his intellectual essence. Although the relationship with Athelstan is purely fictional in the Viking series, the real Alfred suffered from chronic health problems, possibly Crohn's disease, which forced him to rely more on his mind than his sword. He was responsible for reorganizing the Saxon army, creating the Burrs system, fortified cities that the Vikings could not easily take, and founding the English Navy. The series is correct in showing that Alfred didn't just want to expel the Vikings, but to understand them. He realized that education and law were the only ways to unify the small English kingdoms under the banner of Wessex. In history, Alfred is the hero who prevented England from permanently becoming a Norse colony. Fans of the Viking series often feel the series lacks a deeper portrayal of the Berserkers, the legendary warriors who entered a trance of blind rage, supposedly feeling possessed by animal spirits. The series shows Bjorn fighting a bear and some other savage warriors, but rarely explores the phenomenon of berserk. Historically, berserkers were the shock troops of the Norse kings. Dressed in bearskins, berserk, or wolfhounds, they would bite their shields and howl before battle. Studies suggest that this fury was induced by rituals, excessive alcohol consumption, or even hallucinogenic mushrooms like Fly Agaric. The Vikings series opted for cleaner, more tactical combat, perhaps to maintain audience identification with the protagonists. In reality, a Viking battlefield would be far more chaotic and terrifying due to these men who, according to the sagas, were immune to fire and iron while under a trance. In the final seasons of the Viking series, we follow Ubbi's epic journey across the Atlantic to the Golden Land, North America, where he encounters the Mi'kmaq native people. This is one of the series' greatest temporal liberties. Although the Vikings did indeed reach America, the series' protagonists would have been dead for over a century when this happened. The historical fact is that Leif Erikson, the main character in the series, Vikings, Valhalla, it was Ubbi who led the expedition to Vinland around 1000 AD. The Viking series anticipates this event to give an epic closure to the arc of Ragnar's sons. In real life, there is no evidence that Ubba, Ragnar's historical son, sailed beyond England and Ireland. The series, however, uses this arc to show Ragnar's ultimate dream, the search for land where his people could prosper as farmers, and not just as raiders. It's a poetic conclusion that unites the beginning of the series, the search for land, with its end, even if it defies the official chronology by almost 150 years. In the Viking series, we see Ragnar and his sons returning home with chests filled with gold, silver, and liturgical jewels. However, there is a vital component of the Viking economy that the series prefers to downplay: the trafficking of human beings. Although characters like Athelstan begin as slaves, the production downplays the fact that the Vikings were the largest slave traders in Europe and Central Asia during their time. Historically, the term for slave was thrall. Raids on monasteries and villages in England, Ireland, and Eastern Europe were not only aimed at gold, but primarily at young, healthy people. They were the hard currency exchanged in the markets of Dublin or Hedeby for silk, spices, and weapons. In the Vikings series, the focus is on the glory of battle, but the historical truth is that the wealth of Kattegat would be built on the sweat and tragedy of thousands of captives. Slavery was so deeply ingrained that owning slaves was a basic status symbol for any free farmer. By omitting the industrial scale of this trade, the series creates a more heroic and less predatory image of the Norsemen. focusing on the exploitation of land rather than the exploitation of human lives. If there's one thing the Viking series got technically perfect, it was the depiction of the ships. Drakars and Knars, the production used replicas based on real finds, such as the Oseberg and Gokstad ships. To the viewer, the ship is merely a means of transport, but in real history, it was the atomic weapon of the Middle Ages. Unlike the heavy, slow ships of the rest of Europe, Viking vessels had a clinker-built hull, overlapping oak planks. This gave the ship unique flexibility, allowing it to meander over the Atlantic waves without breaking. Furthermore, the shallow draft was the secret to their success. A Viking ship could navigate in waters as shallow as 1 meter deep. This allowed Ragnar, in the Viking series, to appear unexpectedly in the middle of rivers in England or the Seine in Paris, where conventional warships would run aground. The series is remarkably faithful in showing that the ship was not just an object, but a member of the family, built with an engineering expertise that Europe would take centuries to match. Harald Fairhair appears in the Viking series as an ally, and at times rival of Ragnar and Bjorn. His main goal is clear: to be the first king to unify all of Norway under a single crown. In real history, Harald Fairhair, Haraldur Fairhair, he is a central figure in Norwegian history, and the series respects one of the most intriguing legends about him. According to the saga World Roll, Harald swore not to cut or comb his hair until he had conquered all the small kingdoms of Norway, a process that took years, earning him the initial nickname Harald Tanglehair before becoming Fairhair. The Viking series adapts this political ambition, but simplifies the geography. The unification of Norway was not merely a matter of winning battles in Kattegat. It was a brutal and protracted civil war that forced many Viking chieftains to flee to Iceland and the Scottish Islands to maintain their independence. Harald represents the end of Viking freedom and the birth of the organized monarchical state, a historical guise the series uses to show how Ragnar's old world was fading away. The figure of the seer in the Viking series, with his sewn-up eyes and licked tongue, is one of the most bizarre and fascinating in the work. He represents inexorable destiny. In historical reality, however, contact with the supernatural was predominantly made by women, the so-called vulvas or seitkonos. The vulvas were royal prophetesses who enjoyed immense status in Norse society. They traveled between villages, sat on elevated platforms, and entered a trance through chants called Gard Lock. Unlike the isolated seer in the Viking series, the vulvas were political figures consulted before wars and harvests. Archaeologists have found vulva tombs containing magical staffs and narcotic seeds, such as henbane, proving that the mystical aspect of the series had a practical basis in the manipulation of substances and social psychology. The series chose to create a monstrous character to personify destiny, while history shows that the sacred was feminine, influential, and aesthetically far less terrifying. The Viking series portrays the Catholic Church in England and France as a powerful, often corrupt and paranoid institution. Figures like Bishop Heamund and King Ecbert's advisors show a church that struggles to maintain control over the people through fear of the pagan devil. This representation has strong roots in the reality of the Middle Ages. For the 9th century church, the Vikings were not merely invaders, they were God's punishment for the sins of Christendom. The series is accurate in showing how the church amassed immense wealth, making monasteries perfect targets for the Vikings, who did not respect the sanctity of gold. Historically, the church was the main agent for recording these events, as in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which explains why Vikings were portrayed as soulless monsters for centuries. The Viking series inverts this perspective, showing the human side of the Norsemen and the political and calculating side of the clergy, balancing the historical scales of who truly held moral power in those bloody times. In the Viking series, the female figures of the Wessex court, such as Judith and Quenthrith, are portrayed as shrewd political players, driven by forbidden passions and boundless ambitions. However, here, Michael Hirst's poetic license reached its peak. The Judith of the series, who has a romance with Athelstan and plays an almost governmental role, is a distortion of the historical Judith. Judith, the real one, was a Frankish princess, daughter of Charles the Bald, who married King Ethelwulf and later his son Ethelbald, a scandalous practice at the time. However, there is no record of her having had a son named Alfred with a monk, or of her exercising the level of political autonomy shown in the Viking series. Quenthrith, on the other hand, is based on Queen Quenthrith of Mercia, but the series transforms her into a vengeful femme fatale. Historically, women in Saxon courts had little public power, serving mainly as peacemakers between kingdoms. The series gave them modern voices and agency, transforming historical subjugation into a captivating power drama. If you ever got chills from the shield wall command in the Viking series, know that this is one of the most faithful representations of the military tactics of the time. Unlike other films where battle becomes immediate individual chaos, the series shows that survival depended on unity. Shield City, Shield Wall, was the mainstay of Viking and Anglo-Saxon warfare. Historically, a battle wasn't a duel of acrobatics. It was two lines of men squeezing against each other, pushing with their shields and looking for openings to thrust with spears or short swords. The Vikings series captures the claustrophobia and brutality of this tactic well. However, the series errs in showing warriors fighting without helmets or adequate protective armor, just so the audience recognizes the actors' faces. In reality, a Viking who could afford a shield would also have a padded tunic or chainmail, because entering a shield wall with an open chest as on TV would be a quick death sentence. In the 6th season of the Viking series, Ivar the Boneless travels the Silk Road and ends up at the court of Prince Oleg the Prophet in Kievan Rus. Many fans found this arc too fantastical, but it's based on one of the most real pillars of the Norse legacy, the founding of Russia. The Vikings who traveled east were called Rus, possibly meaning those who row. History confirms that the Norsemen, mainly from Sweden, sailed the Volga and Dnieper rivers, establishing trading posts that would become major cities like Novgorod and Kiev. Although a meeting between the historical Ivar and the real Oleg is chronologically impossible, they lived in different decades. The Viking series succeeds in showing the contrast between Western Viking culture and Byzantine influence in the East. The Rus became the ruling elite of the Slavic tribes, and the series perfectly illustrates how Viking DNA and ambition knew no borders, reaching even the gates of Constantinople. One of the most melancholic themes in the final seasons of the Viking series is the loss of faith in the old gods. We see characters like Berserker and even Rollo himself accepting baptism. In real history, Christianization was not just a spiritual choice, but an economic and political necessity imposed from above. Viking chieftains realized that to be accepted as legitimate kings in Europe and to gain access to Christian markets, they needed to adopt the cross. Often, a Viking was baptized multiple times simply to receive the baptismal gifts offered by Frankish kings. In the Viking series, conversion is treated with dramatic weight and an identity crisis. In reality, it was a slow process that took almost 300 years to complete in Scandinavia. The baptism of Guthrum, the Viking leader defeated by Alfred, shown in the series, was a real event in 878 AD, sealing the fate of England as a Christian nation and marking the beginning of the end of the classical Viking age. By the end of the Viking series, the world is no longer the same. The story concludes with Scandinavia ceasing to be a mysterious periphery and becoming an integral part of European politics. Economically, the trade routes opened by Ragnar and his sons connected the Arctic to the Mediterranean, creating a primitive globalization that benefited the economy of the entire continent. Politically, the Viking legacy is visible on the map. The founding of Normandy in France, the Danelaw in England, and Russes in Kiev. The Vikings were not simply defeated, they were assimilated. They became the kings of England, the dukes of France, and the emperors of Russia. The Viking series concludes its narrative by showing that, although the ancient gods have fallen silent, Nordic blood continued to flow in the veins of European nobility for centuries. The age of plunder ended to give way to the age of empires, leaving behind a more connected, more resilient world, eternally marked by the audacity of those who dared to cross the ocean in a wooden boat.